"He's dying, for God's sake, get in here now." The words tore from my throat, raw and jagged, bouncing uselessly off the porch columns of our own home. Just moments before, the morning had held the deceptive peace of routine. I still remember the faint patterns of sunlight filtering through the stained glass window by our front door, casting a cluster of purples and yellows across the foyer floor. It was a strangely cheerful mosaic, a vibrant splash of color that stood in wild, sickening contrast to the crisis unfolding just feet away. My husband, Daniel, was sprawled on the living room floor, not sleeping, not resting, collapsed. His breathing was a shallow, rasping sound that barely stirred his chest. His eyes were half closed, unfocused, and beads of sweat trickled down his temples, plastering strands of graying hair to his skin. His left arm jerked erratically, a bizarre, independent twitch, as if trying to escape his body. In 26 years of marriage, filled with laughter, arguments, and the comfortable silence of shared lives, I had never heard him make sounds like the ones echoing raggedly from his throat that day. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. This wasn't the acid reflux he occasionally complained about after a rich meal. This was bigger, faster, deadlier. The operator's voice on the other end was calm, infuriatingly so, instructing me to stay calm, keep track of his breathing, and wait for the ambulance. Wait? How could I wait? I could already hear the sirens rising, cutting through the quiet suburban morning. Relief, fragile but fierce, began blossoming in my chest. Help was coming. They would know what to do. Then everything fractured. The ambulance screamed to a halt at the curb, lights flashing frantically. 2 uniformed paramedics, Wilson and Lee. I'd later learn their names, jumped out, grabbing their heavy bags of equipment. They rushed toward our front steps and stopped dead. I was leaning out the door, hysteria clawing at my voice, yelling for them to come inside, but they seemed frozen, paralyzed, just yards away. At first, confusion warred with terror. Had they seen something behind me, a threat I hadn't noticed? But the truth, when it became clear, was almost impossible to believe, a nightmare rendered in mundane bureaucracy. Standing between the paramedics and our porch, posture ramrod straight, was Margaret Pierce, the newly elected and already infamous president of the Willow Creek Estates HOA. She held a single sheet of paper, tapping it with an imperious index finger as she spoke to the paramedics, her voice too low for me to hear clearly at first. "He's having a heart attack," I screamed again, the words choking me. "Get in here!" Paramedic Wilson, a tall man whose badge glinted in the morning sun, looked at me, his expression a mixture of absolute confusion and something that might have been fear. He glanced from the paper in Margaret Pierce's hand to the gurney still waiting by the ambulance, then back at me. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice strained, we're being told we're not allowed on the property. HOA orders. There's an access dispute." He looked like he didn't believe his own words. It had to be a joke, a cruel, stupid misunderstanding. I tried to wave him in again, desperate, but Margaret Pierce's voice rang out, sharp and clear, cutting through my panic like brittle glass. "This property is currently under an access dispute regarding Bylaw 18D, she declared, her tone prim, like a principal scolding errant children. "Unauthorized personnel are not permitted entry until the matter is resolved. These are the rules. Unauthorized personnel, they were paramedics. He's dying," I shrieked, the sound inhuman in my head. I saw Daniel's face, red, turning to a terrifying gray, contorted, needing oxygen, needing them. I rushed forward, intending to physically haul them inside if necessary. Damn the consequences, but Margaret didn't flinch. She held up the paper again, that flimsy shield against human decency. "Bylaw 18D, she repeated, citing it like scripture. "Landscaping violations and outstanding fees access is restricted." I saw Wilson clench his jaw, his gaze flicking toward Daniel, visible through the open door. "Ma'am, this is a medical emergency," he protested, his voice tight with contained urgency. Margaret merely tilted her chin. "The bylaws are clear. Violate them, and you personally will face trespassing charges, and a formal complaint will be filed against your license." She looked directly at Wilson. "I will have your badge for this if you step onto this porch." I saw it then, the flicker of conflict between them. Wilson, rigid with disbelief and suppressed rage. Lee, beside him, looking paler, clearly unnerved by the legal threat, the sheer audacity of it. It was a conflict I'd only fully understand later, pieced together from testimonies, that momentary paralysis born of shock and the fear of bureaucratic reprisal. While they hesitated, caught in this absurd standoff, I watched in horror as Daniel's shallow breaths grew even weaker, his lips taking on a pale, purplish tinge. Each word Margaret spoke, each second they stood frozen on the walkway, felt like a hammer blow against the fragile time Daniel had left. The world tilted. How could this be happening? A piece of paper, a petty dispute over rose bushes Daniel had planted slightly over the line, was holding back life-saving help. I stumbled back toward Daniel, kneeling beside him, pressing the heel of my hand onto his sternum, mimicking CPR motions I'd seen on TV. I was no professional, just a terrified wife trying frantically to keep him breathing, keep him here. Finally, blessedly, Wilson seemed to snap. "Screw this," he muttered, the words sharp with frustration. He shouldered past Margaret Pierce, ignoring her indignant gasp. Lee followed instantly, grabbing the bags. "I'm calling the police." Margaret shrieked after them as they crossed the threshold into our home. "Call whoever you want," I screeched back, my voice unrecognizable even to myself. "Just help him!" And they did. They were finally inside, kneeling beside Daniel, tearing open packages, attaching an oxygen mask, starting compressions right there on our living room floor. Help had arrived, but watching them work, a cold dread settled deep in my bones. How much time had been lost? How much damage had already been done? The controlled chaos inside our living room blurred into a frantic rush, the paramedics securing Daniel onto the stretcher, the urgent radio calls, the race to the hospital. I followed in a daze, the flashing lights of the ambulance ahead searing spots into my vision, the earlier desperate hope now curdling into a sickening dread. Time stretched and compressed in the sterile silence of the hospital waiting room, each tick of the institutional clock echoing the agonizing minutes lost on our porch. Finally, a doctor approached, his face etched with practiced sympathy that couldn't soften the blow. "Miss S. Harper," he began, his voice gentle but firm. "We did everything we could. Mr. Harper suffered a massive cardiac arrest. I'm so sorry, but he didn't make it." The world didn't just tilt then, it shattered. Daniel was gone, the vibrant, laughing man who infuriated me with his misplaced tools and charmed me with silly notes on the fridge. The man I had loved for 26 years was simply gone. I didn't cry, not right away. A profound numbness enveloped me, a hollow shield against a pain too vast to comprehend. The official words came later, cold and clinical in the coroner's report, confirming what my gut already screamed. While the cardiac event was severe, it read, "The delay in receiving advanced medical treatment highly likely contributed to the lethal outcome." Highly likely contributed. That sterile phrase ignited something within the icy numbness, a slow burning, white-hot rage. Suddenly, Margaret Pierce's face swam into my mind, not just officious but calm, confident, almost smug, as if my husband's life was merely houses, allegedly encroaching an inch over the property line, a line we were contesting. And somehow, Margaret Pierce had twisted that flimsy rule, in Daniel's most desperate moment, to classify emergency paramedics, lifesavers, as unauthorized personnel. Was it just about the roses, about the $50 fine, or was there something else, some past slight I couldn't recall, that fueled her rigid cruelty? That morning, the suspicion felt ugly, but I couldn't shake it. My grief was soon joined by a sickening unease when I found it tucked under the doormat, a folded piece of paper, no envelope. Inside, scrawled in block letters, "Troublemaker, watch your back." The anonymous malice, coming so soon after Daniel's death, made my blood run cold. Later that afternoon, Henry Thompson, our neighbor from across the street, knocked gently on the door. He was a retired attorney, a kind man with a fondness for flannel shirts, who Daniel used to chat with about lawn care. His eyes were full of genuine sympathy. "Eleanor," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "I am so terribly sorry for your loss." Daniel was a good man. He hesitated, then continued, his gaze troubled. I saw part of it from my window yesterday morning, Eleanor. The ambulance had just sat there for so long before they went in. I saw Miss S. Pierce. She was standing right in their path, talking to them. I didn't understand it then, but seeing the news reports start to trickle out, my God, my breath hitched. "You saw her?" My voice was barely a whisper. You saw her stop them, Henry. He nodded grimly. I did. She was definitely preventing them from reaching your door for several minutes. It was unbelievable. Listen, he leaned in slightly. I know this is the worst possible time, and please tell me if I'm overstepping, but I used to practice law. If you decide if you want to pursue this, find out what really happened, and hold them accountable. I'll help any way I can. Pro bono, of course. What happened to Daniel, it feels criminal. The word hung in the air. Criminal. It echoed the dark thought that had been circling in my own mind. Relief, sharp and unexpected, washed over me. I wasn't alone in this. Yes, I choked out, tears finally stinging my eyes. Yes, please, Henry. The first need help. I have to do something. Henry placed a comforting hand briefly on my arm. All right, he said, his tone shifting, becoming more focused. But, Eleanor, you need to know, this won't be easy. HOAs, especially ones like Willow Creek and Pierce, have resources, insurance, lawyers. They'll fight back hard, try to bury us in paperwork, maybe even try to discredit you or Daniel. It could get ugly. Are you prepared for that? Was I? I thought of Daniel's face, of Margaret Pierce's smugness, of the anonymous threat on my doorstep. There was only one answer. Before I could voice it, my phone rang. It was James, our son, stationed 3 states away. Telling him was the hardest call I'd ever made. His reaction was immediate, fierce, cutting through his own grief. Mom, what is it? No, oh God, Dad. There was a choked silence. Then his voice came back, tight with anger. Mom, yes, do it. Don't you dare let them get away with this. Dad always said, stand up for what's right, especially when it's hard. I'm with you, Mom, whatever you need. His words solidified my resolve. I looked back at Henry, the tears still wet on my cheeks, but my voice was steady now. Yes, Henry, I'm prepared. Let's fight them. We sat down at my kitchen table, the silence of the house pressing in, and began to map out the first steps of a battle I never wanted but now couldn't possibly abandon. The decision made at my kitchen table with Henry Thompson marked the beginning of a grueling new chapter. Armed with grief-fueled determination, we officially filed the civil lawsuit against the Willow Creek Estates HOA and Margaret Pierce personally, alleging wrongful death and gross negligence. Henry handled the complex paperwork, translating my raw anger into the precise language of the law. Almost immediately, his prediction of a fight proved true. The HOA deployed a team of expensive-looking lawyers whose first moves were predictable, attempts to dismiss the case or drown us in procedural delays. Simultaneously, Henry informed me the district attorney's office had taken an interest. They're opening their own investigation, Eleanor, he explained grimly over the phone one evening. Based on the initial police report and the paramedic statements, they're considering criminal charges against Pierce. Involuntary manslaughter isn't off the table. The word sent a fresh chill down my spine. This was escalating beyond anything I could have imagined. A local tragedy quickly metastasized into a national news story. Apparently, the tale of a grieving widow whose husband died after being blocked by an overzealous HOA president struck a chord. Suddenly, our quiet cul-de-sac was crawling with news vans. Microphones were constantly being shoved in my face, and letters and emails poured in, some supportive, sharing similar HOA horror stories, others disturbingly hostile. I became, unwillingly, a symbol for homeowner frustration everywhere, a role I found deeply uncomfortable. Daniel's memory felt cheapened by the media frenzy. Behind the scenes, the real work was painstaking. Henry and I spent countless hours gathering documents, years of HOA correspondence, the meeting minutes where Bylaw 18D was quietly introduced, records of the landscaping dispute. We tracked down neighbors who had witnessed parts of the incident. Securing official, detailed statements from paramedics Wilson and Lee was crucial. They confirmed, unequivocally, that they had announced a critical medical emergency and were still explicitly denied access by Margaret Pierce. One neighbor, Clara, who lived 2 doors down and had a clearer view of the porch than Henry, initially agreed to provide a statement, but then grew fearful. Eleanor, I want to help, I really do, she'd whispered over the phone, her voice trembling slightly. But Margaret people are afraid of her. What if they make trouble for us? My husband's worried about property values. It took Henry's calm reassurance about legal protections and my own quiet plea, reminding her of Daniel, to finally convince her to sign a truthful affidavit about seeing Margaret physically blocking the paramedic's path for what felt like an eternity. Her fear was a stark reminder of the power Margaret wielded in our community. The legal bills began mounting, adding a layer of gnawing anxiety to my grief. Could I even afford to see this through? The thought was a constant, unwelcome companion. Then came the breakthrough Henry had been hoping for. "Eleanor, we got it." His voice was electric with restrained excitement over the phone. My tech guy managed to recover deleted files from the HOA server backup. There's an internal memo from Pierce herself. He emailed it to me moments later. My hands shook as I read it. Dated just 2 weeks before Daniel died, it was addressed to HOA security and board members. It explicitly stated that, due to ongoing disputes with certain properties, ours was listed under no circumstances is access to be granted to any external personnel, including utility workers or emergency services, regardless of stated urgency, without my direct prior authorization. Regardless of stated urgency. The calculated coldness of it stole my breath. This wasn't just a misinterpretation of a bylaw, it was a premeditated policy. That memo opened the floodgates during the legal discovery process. Soon after, Henry presented me with printouts of email chains between Margaret and several board members. The exchanges were horrifying. One board member had questioned the memo, writing, "Margaret, blocking EMS seems risky. What if it's a real emergency? That's a lawsuit waiting to happen." Margaret's reply was swift and dismissive. "We must enforce bylaw 18D strictly, or everyone will think they can flout the rules. They can sue us if they want. We can't keep letting people ignore citations." They knew at least some of them knew the potential danger, discussed it, and Margaret had pushed ahead anyway, prioritizing HOA enforcement over a potential life or death scenario. Armed with the memo and these emails, Henry looked at me, his expression grim but resolute. "Now," he said quietly, "we take them to court." Armed with the chilling memo and Margaret Pierce's own incriminating emails, we finally walked into the packed county courthouse nearly 6 months after Daniel's death. The air outside crackled with a morbid kind of electricity. News vans lined the street, reporters jostled for position, and curious onlookers whispered behind their hands. Inside, the courtroom was standing room only, a sea of faces reflecting varying degrees of curiosity, sympathy, and judgment. Each day felt like walking a gauntlet, my private grief laid open for public consumption. Henry was a steady presence beside me, James, having flown in whenever his Air Force leave allowed, his quiet fury a mirror of my own. The trial unfolded over days that bled into weeks, a grueling marathon of legal arguments and raw emotion. The prosecution laid out the case meticulously, building from the frantic 911 call to the devastating coroner's report. Paramedic Wilson took the stand, his voice low but steady, recounting the events of that morning with painful clarity. He described arriving to a clear emergency, being physically blocked by Margaret Pierce, her explicit citation of bylaw 18D, and her direct threat against his license, even after he'd stressed the urgency of possible cardiac arrest. She was adamant, Wilson stated, his gaze level. She made it clear that accessing the property to treat Mr. Harper would be considered trespassing. Rules were rules, emergency or not. Paramedic Lee corroborated his account, her voice quieter but firm. Their testimonies painted a damning picture of deliberate obstruction. When it was my turn, the courtroom fell utterly silent. Standing there, facing the judge, the jury, and Margaret Pierce herself, who sat rigidly beside her lawyers, avoiding my gaze felt surreal. Henry had prepped me, reminding me to stick to the facts, but recounting those last terrible minutes of Daniel's conscious life, describing his gasping breaths while help stood mere yards away, arguing about bylaws, threatened to shatter my composure. I spoke of our 26 years together, of the man Daniel was, and then described the horror of that morning, the disbelief turning to terror, as Margaret Pierce prioritized her rule book over my husband's life. Reliving it under the sterile courtroom lights felt like tearing the wound open anew, but I held on to the image of Daniel's face, fueled by the need for truth. The prosecution then presented the physical evidence, bylaw 18D itself, the damning internal memo Margaret had authored, instructing staff to block access regardless of stated urgency, and the email chains where board members had explicitly raised concerns about blocking emergency services, only to be dismissed by Margaret's insistence on strict enforcement above all else. The collective gasp from the gallery when the prosecutor read aloud Margaret's email reply, "They can sue us if they want," "We can't keep letting people ignore citations," was audible. The callous disregard for human life hung heavy in the air. Finally, Margaret Pierce took the stand. Dressed in a severe navy pantsuit, her hair pulled back tightly, she initially projected an air of wronged authority. She spoke calmly, attempting to portray the incident as a simple misunderstanding, a procedural check gone slightly awry in a stressful situation. She claimed she only intended to verify the paramedics' credentials, that she never truly intended to prevent them from helping Daniel. But under the prosecutor's relentless cross-examination, her carefully constructed facade began to crumble. He hammered her with the evidence, point by point. "Mr. Wilson and Miss Lee testified under oath that you explicitly told them they were not permitted entry due to bylaw 18D. Is that not correct, Miss Pierce?" "I was merely explaining the current property status," she began, but the prosecutor cut her off. "And is this your signature, Miss Pierce, on an internal memo instructing personnel to deny access, regardless of stated urgency?" He held up the document. She paled slightly. "That memo pertained to ongoing issues with unapproved contractors. It makes no distinction, does it? And it explicitly mentions emergency services. Furthermore, in this email, he projected it onto the screen. When a board member warned you about the risk of blocking an emergency, you replied, 'They can sue us if they want,' didn't you?" Margaret shifted in her seat, her composure fraying. She began to stammer, contradicting her earlier statements. The prosecutor pressed harder, questioning her motivation for enforcing such a minor bylaw violation. The rose bushes, the small outstanding fee with such rigidity in the face of a dying man. Pushed into a corner, her voice rising, Margaret finally snapped. The carefully controlled mask slipped, revealing something ugly underneath. "People like them," she spat out, gesturing vaguely toward where I sat. "They always think the rules don't apply, not to their landscaping, their late fees, their supposed emergencies. Someone has to uphold standards." The outburst silenced the courtroom. The mask was off. It wasn't just about rules. It was about power, about resentment, about making an example, even at the cost of a human life. I felt a cold, sick confirmation wash over me. She looked rattled then, realizing what she'd revealed, her face flushing crimson. Her attorney quickly requested a recess, but the damage was done. The jury deliberated for 2 draining days. Waiting for the verdict was its own form of torture. James sitting beside me, his hand gripping mine tightly, Henry offering quiet words of encouragement, but the anxiety was a physical weight in my chest. Finally, the call came. The jury had reached a decision. We filed back into the hushed courtroom. I avoided looking at Margaret Pierce. The air was thick with tension as the jury foreperson stood. "In the matter of the state versus Margaret Pierce," the foreperson read, her voice clear and steady, "on the charge of involuntary manslaughter, we find the defendant guilty." A collective exhale swept the room. In the civil matter of Eleanor Harper versus Willow Creek Estates, HOA, and Margaret Pierce, we find the defendants liable for wrongful death and negligence. The amount of damages awarded felt both enormous and meaningless. Margaret Pierce didn't scream or cry, she just stared straight ahead, her face utterly devoid of color, her eyes glassy with shock. As bailiffs moved quickly to escort her out, she looked like a statue carved from ice. I felt no triumph, only a profound, aching emptiness. Justice had been served, perhaps, but it couldn't rewind time, couldn't bring Daniel back. Tears finally tracked silently down my cheeks, tears of exhaustion, sorrow, and the sheer crushing weight of it all. Navigating the chaotic scrum of reporters outside the courthouse, leaning on James and Henry, I felt a glare cut through the noise. It was another board member, one whose name I recognized from the email chains. As we passed, she leaned in slightly, her voice a low hiss meant only for me. "This isn't over, Mrs. Harper." The fight for justice had been won in court, but her words were a chilling reminder that the battle for peace might be far from finished. The fallout from the trial was swift. News spread that the entire Willow Creek Estates HOA board had resigned en masse in the face of the verdict and potential further lawsuits. The HOA itself, buried under legal fees and public disgrace, formally dissolved shortly after. The reign of petty tyranny was over. A week later, I finally found the strength to go to the funeral home and retrieve Daniel's ashes. Holding the heavy urn felt like holding the tangible weight of my loss. I placed it on the mantel in the living room, ironically near the very spot where he had collapsed that horrific morning. Life began to settle into a new, hollow rhythm. I started small, reclaiming pieces of our life that the old HOA had dictated. I had the house siding replaced pale blue with white trim, the colors Daniel and I had always wanted, but which hadn't met Margaret Pierce's approved palette. I swapped our regulation mailbox for an old-fashioned one with a little red flag. Tiny acts of rebellion, perhaps, but they felt like breathing again, asserting that this was our home. A group of neighbors, weary of the old regime and inspired by the possibility of change, banded together to form a new, leaner homeowner coalition, focused solely on essential shared maintenance and transparency. They asked if I'd serve as an honorary advisor, ensuring the past mistakes wouldn't be repeated. I agreed on the condition that every decision be open and voted on by the community. We learned of minor pushback flyers for the new coalition torn down, anonymous grumbles, remnants of the fear the old board had fostered. A faint echo of the threat hissed at me outside the courthouse. Surprisingly, I even received a quiet email from one former board member, the one who'd questioned Margaret in the emails, offering a sincere apology and some background information that proved helpful to the new group. James came home on leave, and seeing him step onto the porch where his father had fought for his last breaths was heart-wrenching. But his tight hug and whispered, "I'm proud of you, Mum. Dad would be too," felt like a balm. We spent hours talking, laughing through tears, remembering Daniel before bylaw 18D became his death sentence. Healing, I discovered, wasn't a straight line. It ambushed you in quiet moments, triggered by a stray fishing lure found under the couch, or the echo of a song he used to hum. I politely declined offers from sensational morning talk shows wanting to feature the HOA nightmare, determined to protect Daniel's memory from becoming mere entertainment. About a year after his passing, James joined me at the lake where Daniel and I had first fished as a young couple. Releasing his ashes into the wind, watching them disperse over the water, shimmering in the early light, felt both tragic and freeing. I later learned our story had reverberated far beyond Willow Creek. Several states began re-examining HOA powers, specifically addressing emergency service access, ensuring no petty rule could ever again block paramedics or firefighters. Margaret Pierce remains in prison. Her appeals have been denied. It's a meager consolation, knowing Daniel's unnecessary death might spare another family this agony. But in that legacy, perhaps his spirit lives on. You learn, when you lose so much, about a resilience you never knew you possessed. You learn that love endures beyond bylaws and heartbeats, and that sometimes fighting for what's right, even through unimaginable grief, can actually change the world one small, hard-won victory at a time.